Let's get some analysis then on the legacy of Jean-Marie Le Pen. Angela Diffley with me now. And Angela, when we look at his rise to power and his influence, I wonder how much of that you think is due to Jean-Marie Le Pen, the man, and how much was due to the issues that he espoused?
I think it's an interesting question. Certainly, Jean-Marie Le Pen, as a personality, was a hard man. There's very little evidence of compassion. He had a very hard upbringing, and I think that is significant in his character. He was very single-minded and pursued his objectives. He was also forged, as many people of his generation were, by his experiences in the Algerian War of Independence and in Indochina, and broadly by the loss of France's colonies. It was never fully answered, the question, incidentally, of whether he partook in torture during that war. That is a massive issue, which was never fully disclosed either way. This is a very unsympathetic character on the outside. That said, his story, in many ways, there were similar stories in many other countries at the time. We heard there in that package talk about how he said, French jobs for French people. He has omitted to point out that many of the roads in France in the 1960s were built by Algerian labourers, that much of the workforce, many people doing difficult, dirty jobs at the time that French people didn't want to do, were being done by Algerians. It's very similar to the Irish in Britain who built the roads and the West Indians. Many ordinary British people didn't want to do those jobs at the time. So that is a fact. It is something that was going on. In the 1970s, Giscard d'Estaing, right-wing president, changed the rules so that immigrants, were allowed to bring in their families. This made it more costly. There was less and less money around. And I think that, as you saw a similar story in many other parts of the world, fueled resentment. There was less money. Who were all these people coming in? There were problems with the welcome they were given. There were problems with how these families integrated, and all of that contributed. Another very important factor, I think, which is sometimes not mentioned, is the role of François Mitterrand in all of this. He, of course, a very famous left-wing president in France, socialist president. He deliberately facilitated the rise of the Front National, the far-right Front National, because, this is politics, he wanted to divide the right and to allow his own socialist party to emerge victorious. That's how politics works. It's an ugly business, but that also contributed to his rise. After all that is said, I think it's very important to note that in 2002, when he got into the final round of the French presidential elections against Jacques Chirac, the French overwhelmingly came out, whatever their political colour, and said, we do not want this. Interesting to look at some of the reactions coming out today. The reaction from the Élysée Palace, from Macron's entourage, is very neutral. They express condolences for his family and simply say something along the lines of his public career will be judged by history, because he was very much a man of his time. That sort of thing is beyond the pale nowadays.
Indeed, and he was convicted, wasn't he, of anti-Semitism. There is, of course, still a major problem here in France with anti-Semitic attacks, anti-Semitic language. How much of that do you think we can trace back to Jean-Marie Le Pen himself?
I think if you talk to French Jews, there's often this idea of old anti-Semitism and new anti-Semitism. And he embodied, Jean-Marie Le Pen, famously, there is this quotation which followed him for the rest of his life, and he repeated that the Holocaust was a detail of the Second World War. He was convicted, as you just said, for anti-Semitic comments. But he embodied a right-wing Catholic traditional type of anti-Semitism, which can be seen in other countries in Europe. Don't forget, in the Second World War, the Catholic Church did not cover itself in glory over its attitude to the Jews. And so that is a particular type of anti-Semitism that was prevalent amongst the establishment in Europe, the Catholic establishment in Europe, because much of the establishment in Europe was Catholic. Marine Le Pen has clearly thrown that out. She has tried to make a very clear line and said, we are not about that anymore. And she has taken every opportunity to speak out very vocally against another kind of anti-Semitism, which is Islamist anti-Semitism. And many people say she has basically swapped anti-Semitism for being anti-Muslim. But she has, on numerous occasions, stood up for French Jews who have been the victims of Islamist terrorism or Islamist anti-Semitism. Some Jews are convinced that some French Jews are convinced that the new Rassemblement National, her version of the party, after she threw her father out and renamed it, is not particularly anti-Semitic. Very many of them are very wary of it, think that it still is anti-Semitic, and also, even if it isn't, dislike its racism, dislike what they see as a perceived anti-Muslim stance. So on the question of anti-Semitism, there is nothing very clear.